The Red Shoes, starring Moira Shearer and Anton Walbrook. She lived to dance and died by the same desire. In post-war Britain, audiences were desperate for color, beauty, and escape. When The Red Shoes premiered in 1948, it seemed to offer all three: lavish costumes, sweeping music, and an ambitious story about a young ballerina's rise to fame. Directed by Michael Powell and Emeric Pressburger, The Red Shoes tells the story of Victoria Page, a gifted dancer caught between two consuming forces: her love for a rising composer and her duty to dance under the obsessive mentorship of a tyrannical impresario, Lermontov, played by Anton Walbrook. The central metaphor is drawn from Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, a girl who puts on red ballet shoes and cannot stop dancing, even to her death. Powell and Pressburger use that legend not as a fantasy but as a reflection of artistic obsession. In the film's final haunting sequence, Victoria runs from the theater in her red shoes, not to the arms of her lover, not to a triumphant curtain call, but into the path of an oncoming train. The moment is surreal. Just years removed from a global war, they were ready for healing, not fatalism. Critics were split. Some praised the film's audacity and innovation. Others found the conclusion too cold, too final. C.A. Lejeune, writing for The Observer, called the film dazzling. Moira Shearer, the real-life ballerina who played Victoria, later revealed how emotionally taxing the role had been. Filming the climactic scenes left her drained, both physically and psychologically. A story that punished female ambition, a cautionary tale cloaked in velvet and color. A Place in the Sun, starring Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor. He had everything he ever wanted: beauty, love, ambition. And yet, it all led to a walk down a corridor toward death. When A Place in the Sun premiered in 1951, audiences expected elegance, romance, and moral triumph. Montgomery Clift plays George Eastman, a young man of modest means who finds himself drawn into the glittering world of wealth through a distant relative's factory. There, he meets Angela Vickers, a magnetic socialite portrayed by a luminous Elizabeth Taylor in one of her earliest dramatic roles. But George is already involved with Alice Tripp, a factory girl played with aching sincerity by Shelley Winters. In a moment of desperation, he invites her on a boat trip. Whether he intended to push her or not remains ambiguous, but Alice falls overboard and dies. George survives, but peace does not. George walks calmly toward the electric chair. There's no outburst, no last-minute rescue. Outside, Angela waits, helpless. Her expression says, everything's sorrow, disbelief, and the realization that love cannot undo fate. There is no epilogue, just silence. And the weight of consequence. Audiences were shaken. Used to neat resolutions and heroes redeemed, viewers weren't prepared for a protagonist who was both guilty and sympathetic. George wasn't a monster, but he wasn't innocent either. That ambiguity made the ending hard to process and impossible to forget. Critics praised the film's craftsmanship. George Stevens won the Academy Award for Best Director. The film earned 6 Oscars in total. But still, there was discomfort. The studio considered softening the ending for Hollywood's more traditional audience, but ultimately chose to stay faithful to Dreiser's vision, a decision that preserved the story's brutal honesty. The Blue Angel, starring Emil Jannings and Marlene Dietrich. He was a respected professor until he met a woman who didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself for her. When The Blue Angel premiered in 1930, it was like a punch to the gut. Directed by Joseph von Sternberg and based on Heinrich Mann's novel Professor Unrat, The Blue Angel follows Professor Emanuel Roth, a rigid, conservative schoolteacher who becomes infatuated with Lola Lola, a nightclub singer played by a then-unknown Marlene Dietrich. Roth begins the film as a man of dignity and status. He ends it as a broken clown in her traveling cabaret show, laughed at by drunks, stripped of all respect, barely recognizable. Lola doesn't beguile him with witchcraft or deceit. She simply exists, sensual, independent, magnetic. And Roth, desperate for something more than the sterile life he's built, in the last scene, Rath returns to the classroom where he once ruled with authority. He clutches his old desk, unable to speak, unable to cry, barely even alive. He dies there, emotionally hollowed out, physically wrecked. And Lola? She keeps singing. In Germany, where the film was made, The Blue Angel was denounced for its themes of moral decay and emotional weakness. It was banned, labeled degenerate. Jennings, once hailed, aligned himself with the regime. Dietrich, meanwhile, fled to America and would later refuse to return to Germany during Hitler's reign. But long before politics took hold, The Blue Angel had already become a landmark film, not for its glamour, but for its brutal honesty. The story of Temple Drake, starring Miriam Hopkins. She survived the unthinkable, but Hollywood wasn't ready to show the truth, so they changed it. Based on William Faulkner's infamous novel Sanctuary, the film tackled issues far beyond the comfort zone of early Hollywood assault, complicity, moral corruption, and the fragile line between victim and survivor. Miriam Hopkins plays Temple Drake, a rebellious Southern belle whose flirtations and pride lead her into a web of danger. After seeking shelter at a rundown plantation, she's held against her will and subjected to a life of degradation in the criminal underworld. In Faulkner's novel, Temple is a complex character, both broken and complicit, struggling to make peace with her trauma in a world that refuses to understand her, redeeming herself in a final courtroom confession that feels forced, scripted, and ultimately untrue to Faulkner's original vision. "This is not Sanctuary," one reviewer wrote in The Nation. "It's a ghost pale and trembling of what it was meant to be." Miriam Hopkins gave a performance that still drew praise. Critics noted her emotional intensity, her ability to show fear, shame, and resilience all at once. But even she couldn't salvage a story that had been scrubbed of its soul. Religious groups still condemned the film, despite the edits. And in cities like Memphis and Atlanta, it was outright banned. The irony was painful. Hollywood changed the ending to avoid scandal and still got scandal. Today, the story of Temple Drake is seen as a pivotal moment in film censorship history. It's often cited as one of the key catalysts for the strict enforcement of the Hays Code that would dominate Hollywood for decades. And the ending? It wasn't just disappointing, it was dishonest.